Sitting at the small wooden table, you glance across at your friend, whose face is etched with sincerity and gravity. They lean forward, elbows resting on the table's edge, their steady gaze locking onto yours. With a deep breath, they say, "Your father will be let down if you don't find it in your heart to forgive and respect your spouse." The words linger in the air, laden with unspoken expectations. Your mind races back to those piercing moments when your spouse's words felt like sharp knives, cutting deep into your soul, and the times when their actions left indelible marks. Yet, they remain unwavering in their stance, insisting they did no wrong. Silence blankets the room as you grapple with the burden of their plea, feeling the intense pressure to mend fences with someone who refuses to acknowledge the pain they've inflicted. As a Christian who endured the scars of childhood abuse, I've often found myself in conversations with fellow believers who insist, Jesus will be disappointed if you don't find it in your heart to forgive and respect your parents. Their words echo in my mind, accompanied by earnest expressions and gentle yet firm tones, as if they're sharing a divine truth. Sometimes they lean in closer, emphasizing their point with unwavering conviction, cautioning me that my salvation hangs in the balance. Forgiveness and honoring your parents are non-negotiable for a true Christian, they assert, leaving me grappling with the heavy weight of their expectations. No rational person would ever emotionally manipulate a spouse who has suffered abuse, urging them to return to their abuser and extend forgiveness, simply to avoid disappointing their father. The scenario seems unthinkable, yet why do we as Christians sometimes apply the same pressure in cases of abuse? We might find ourselves encouraging a victim to turn the other cheek, emphasizing forgiveness as a virtue above personal safety and healing, often neglecting the gravity of the harm inflicted. The first time this happened to me, a chill ran down my spine, and my heart pounded with an unfamiliar dread. The thought of losing my salvation felt like teetering on the edge of a dark abyss. As days passed, frustration bubbled inside me, a constant gnawing at my understanding. How could being saved by grace hinge on me forgiving and respecting my parents, who had caused me so much hurt? Confusion gave way to anger, a hot, simmering rage. If what I had been taught was true, I questioned whether I wanted anything to do with a God who seemed indifferent to my suffering and threatened me with the horrors of hell and eternal damnation unless I buried my pain and pretended it didn't exist. I felt an unwavering certainty deep within me that Jesus was alive, a truth I had encountered repeatedly throughout my life. My heart, however, was bubbling with frustration and anger. As much as I wanted to abandon my faith in that moment, I couldn't ignore the persistent pull to seek clarity. This inner turmoil urged me to delve deeper and scrutinize the teachings and claims shared by my fellow believers, questioning their authenticity and exploring the truth for myself. In my journey of faith, one of the initial revelations was that the laws in the Old Testament weren't as clear-cut as I had been taught. Growing up as a Christian, I had internalized the belief that a sin was always a sin, no exceptions. For instance, a lie, whether big or small, was considered sinful. We were all guilty, it was said, because everyone lies, even if it's to spare someone's feelings or to save a life. This led to a belief that adhering to the law was an insurmountable task since, inevitably, situations arise where telling the truth could harm someone emotionally or physically. However, as I delved into the Old Testament, I encountered a different perspective. Here was a God who seemed to recognize the complexities of human situations. He suggested that not all sins were equal, and sometimes actions we might perceive as sinful were necessary to avoid greater sins. For example, preserving life. Paramount. In these ancient texts, it was considered a far greater sin to cause physical harm or death than to tell an untruth. Thus, if you spoke the truth and it resulted in someone's injury or death, you were still falling into sin despite your intentions. To truly do the right thing, you sometimes had to choose what seemed like a sin at first glance, such as telling a lie to protect someone, thereby aligning with a deeper moral imperative. In that moment, a realization hit me hard. The commandment to honor your parents and forgive revolved around the same core principle. Yet, this understanding left me tangled in a web of contradiction. Could it truly be that there were times when honoring and forgiving were sins, just as there were times when failing to do so was sinful? In the Old Testament, the paramount principle is the preservation and protection of life. along with recognizing the intrinsic worth and value inherent in every individual. This commandment is so vital that it supersedes nearly all other commandments, always taking priority except for the one that declares it a sin to worship idols. For instance, if honoring and forgiving one's parents poses a threat to one's physical safety or undermines personal dignity and value, this commandment to preserve life unequivocally overrides the obligation to honor and forgive, illustrating its supreme importance. In my situation, and I understand every situation is unique, the threat to my physical safety was very real. The emotional abuse was so intense that it nearly pushed me to the brink of suicide during my younger years. It was a relentless assault on my personal dignity and sense of self-worth. I remember the countless nights I spent trying to make them see the damage they were causing. I would approach them, heart pounding, hoping for a moment of empathy or acknowledgement. But each time, my words were met with blank stares, dismissive gestures, and a refusal to admit any wrongdoing. It felt like shouting into a void, my pleas swallowed by their indifference. In the end, I realized the only way to protect myself was to sever all ties with them. Maintaining contact would have been a betrayal of my own self-respect, a sin against my own well-being. Preserving my dignity and ensuring my physical safety had to take precedence over the traditional duty of honoring my parents. But then the argument is made that you should at least forgive them, regardless of the circumstances. In the traditional Christian perspective, forgiveness is deeply intertwined with the concept of salvation. It embodies an unconditional grace, a release without strings attached, even if the wrongdoer neither seeks forgiveness nor admits to any wrongdoing. This mirrors the belief that God extended forgiveness to humanity through Jesus Christ, offering grace while people were still entrenched in their sins before they even realized their transgressions or sought divine pardon. In the Old Testament, the Bible that Jesus, the apostles, Paul, and the early Christians followed, forgiveness hinges on the offender's willingness to seek it. If the wrongdoer doesn't recognize their need for forgiveness, the person who was wronged is not required to forgive. The act of forgiving someone who doesn't desire it is considered a wrongdoing in itself. From the standpoint of the Old Testament, I am not compelled to forgive my parents, who have never taken steps to ask for my forgiveness or acknowledged any wrongdoing on their part. No rational person would ever try to convince a spouse who has already endured the trauma of abuse to go back to their abuser with open arms and offer forgiveness. The idea seems unimaginable, and yet, as Christians, we sometimes impose similar pressures in situations of abuse. Picture a well-intentioned church member sitting across from a victim, softly urging them to turn the other cheek and highlighting forgiveness as the ultimate virtue, often overshadowing the importance of personal safety and the need for emotional healing. In this misguided attempt to avoid disappointing Jesus, we might overlook the deep wounds inflicted on the victim. Why do we find ourselves in this position? It stems from being taught that as New Testament Christians, the teachings of the Old Testament hold little relevance for us. However, by embracing this narrow viewpoint, we are inadvertently committing a grave sin, placing lives in danger by persuading spouses, children, or friends to return to toxic, harmful relationships. Aren't you thankful that the Bible, cherished by Jesus, Paul, and the early Christians, includes the Old Testament, which actually emphasizes the importance of protecting our own worth, value, and lives? It allows for actions that might seem sinful in other contexts to safeguard ourselves from harm.